And if you've joined us before, you know that one thing that we always do is in the chat, we like to hear where you're joining us from, and we always kind of mix it up with a different question. So today, we'd love to hear where you're joining us from and what is your favorite fall activity. I am so ready for a Gilmore Girls rewatch, if you're asking me. That's my favorite fall activity. Just about ready to dive back into Stars Hollow. I'm so ready. And it's always fun to see where people are joining us from and see who else is nearby. Our team is located in Washington, D.C., and we're excited to have everyone here with us. Apple picking, yes, and pie picking. So much college football, yes. Okay, more from Virginia, and picking apples, a lot of apples, pumpkins, love it. I'm so ready. Let's go fall. Pro football. Aw, hi Paige. And awesome fall coffee. Yes, I was talking with our new team member Sam today about loving the fall flavors of coffee. More football. Yep, gone. Next T Swift album, but of course, October 3rd, get ready. Is anyone having trouble with audio? Please let us know if you are. Were you late? I will follow. I love that. Oh, I love it. We'll keep it coming. We are excited to welcome everyone today to our governance panel webinar. Let's see. I'm just loving these comments. Coffee by the fire, amazing. Well, hopefully we'll have some late joiners, so we'll go ahead and get started, but it's always fun to see and just kick off with a little bit of fun. We are excited to welcome you all today, and just as a reminder for those joining us again or joining us for the first time, Institute is a CAE and a CCE approved provider, so that means that this webinar does qualify for 1 hour of CAE credit and 1 point of CCE credit. And if you are present on the webinar today, so not listening to the recording after you be present on the webinar today, you can request a webinar certificate by emailing us at iom@uschamber.com. I'm going to just drop it here in the chat. And a recording of today's webinar and the presentation will be available online after the webinar. So you can still locate those afterwards if you are looking to rewatch and follow along. And thank you for those who submitted questions on the registration page prior to the webinar today. So those will be the start of the webinar questions that we're going to ask our panelists. We do have other questions as well. And if something comes up during that you have a question, please drop that in the chat, and we will be incorporating questions from the chat in the panelist questions as well today. So at any point, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. So we are excited to announce our 2 panelist speakers today. So we have Lisa Weitzel, IOM CAE. Lisa serves as the president and CEO of the Illinois Association of Chamber of Commerce Execs, IACCE, and she specializes in governance and association and chamber management and conducts strategic planning sessions and board trainings for 501c6 and 501c3 organizations. She recently concluded her service on the Midwest Board of Regents, and she is an incredible faculty member. And Edward McMurray, JD MBA, is principal with Association Governance Advisors. Ed is a dedicated legal strategist focused exclusively on the unique needs of associations, nonprofit organizations, and other tax-exempt entities. He brings a results-oriented approach to guiding clients toward greater impact and sustainability, excelling at translating complex legal matters into practical, actionable solutions. He's an active participant in the association and nonprofit community, contributing to nonprofit excellence through board advisor roles and speaking engagements. Outside of his professional life, he is passionate about fine wine, diverse cuisines, and global travel, and his partner, and he is a devoted cat dad. And we are going to kick it off. I'm seeing here in the chat that there may be some audio issues. I just wanted to check in quickly that my voice is a little spotty. I am going to, just to make sure that we get this worked out, I'll have my colleague Nathan step in momentarily just to read the questions, and I will troubleshoot some audio on my end. So we'll go ahead and get started. Nathan, if I can have you start by reading the questions, and I will troubleshoot some audio on my end.
So yeah, Lisa, we'll start with you on the first question. Are people using governance committees, and how often are they meeting?
In my experience, only very large associations are using governance committees. Uh, the exception to that would be if a smaller association or a chamber is redoing their bylaws, and then they might have a bylaws committee. But they're typically ad hoc, so they're only being used as needed. Um, they may have a standing governance committee for really large associations again, but they still don't meet regularly in my experience. I don't know if Ed has any thoughts about that.
In my experience, Lisa, it's pretty much the same thing. Unless you're a very, very large association, um, there's really no standing governance committee. As things come up, I've seen a lot of ad hoc committees or task force created for very specific issues, but nothing really at a standing committee level.
All right. So we'll move on to the next question. What are the best practices for effectively using a consent agenda? Ed, we'll start with you on this one.
First and foremost, use a consent agenda. Trust me, it'll make your meetings go a lot smoother. And with the best practices of using it, make it focus on those things that are mundane. Committee reports, if you have them, approval of minutes, stuff that takes time, but there's really no deliberation or discussion about it because it's just the regular course of business. So for those items that are the regular course of business or accepting committee reports, the consent agenda is your best friend, because that way your board can then focus on the actual important business it needs to discuss.
All right, Lisa, same to you.
Yes, so for an example, having your minutes and your financials put into a consent agenda, having committee reports, as Ed said, in another consent agenda item. As long as the board chair, board president makes it very clear that there's the ability to pull out one of the items in the consent agenda to discuss.
All right. Some of these questions will be easier to answer. Some of these will be harder to answer, but I think the next one will be kind of harder to answer. And Lisa, you get the unfortunate start for this one. How do you handle a highly respected chairperson who overreaches, especially when the board won't challenge them publicly?
I am going to look at that highly respected chairperson means that they're highly respected in the community, perhaps maybe not as much within the organization, and that person may feel ownership over it. Two ways to approach it is if there's a past chair who's also highly respected, who's still involved with the organization, to ask that person to intercede on behalf of the organization and explain the role of governance and what their particular role is. You can bring in an expert, somebody from outside the community to come in and do board trainings. Depending on the personality of that person, they may think that that's all well and good, but it doesn't apply to them. Um, I think that having a consistent board governance best practices ingrained, perhaps even in every board meeting, taking 5 minutes to talk about, we're going to focus on this piece of best practices today, and then go on and maybe over time. But having a past chair, I think, is maybe a good way to handle this.
All right, same question to you, Ed.
When I hear about these situations, the one thing that I always think about is the old saying that boards govern, staff manage. And I think it's very, very important, to Lisa's point, that every year at your board turnover, or every 2 years, depending on when your board terms are, having a board orientation is one of the best ways to prevent things like this happening, because it talks about the roles and responsibilities of the board member and the staff and why there's a difference between the two. In a situation like this, yeah, I think a past board chair, as Lisa said, is a great way to kind of intercede, kind of diffuse a situation, for lack of a better phrase, but to really make sure that the board is focusing on the business that they need to be focusing on, and then they let the staff handle the stuff that is the staff is responsible to.
All right. I believe Cece is back with better audio. Your voice of God will go back to being in the background.
Excellent. Thank you all for your patience. And thank you both. That was, I think, a great answer to the reminder of the difference of board and staff roles. Yep, seeing here in the comments, a lot of board governs, staff manages. Excellent. And on to the next question from our pre-submitted attendee questions. How do you retool a governance model when so many members equate engagement with a large governance structure? Start with Ed, if you can start with us with this question.
Well, I'm going to start with kind of the engagement aspect of this question. I think that you don't need to have, a large board or a large, membership community. If you're a chamber, a large amount of businesses to be involved to have effective governance. And effective governance starts, from day one. It starts with your bylaws. It starts with your executive director, your chamber director, to instill, what it is to be governing effectively. The other thing about that is that you also have to have good engagement from your board members. So good governance comes from good engagement. It doesn't necessarily always come from, a large amount of members or a larger board. You could have a board that has 35 people on it and they get nothing done because all they do is talk about themselves or, what they're doing that weekend. But you could have a board that only has 5 members that's very engaged, very effective, and they don't have a lot of committees. They're more, but they're very focused. They get a lot done and they believe in good governance. So when you have a situation like that and you want to try and reinvigorate, your governance, it comes down to engagement. And you have to have engaged board members. For chambers, you have to have businesses that are engaged so that they can, effectively choose their board. They can be involved in the chamber. If you're an association, you have to have, engaging members so that you have a volunteer pool that you could tap into. So it doesn't necessarily mean the size of your board or the size of the governance structure. It's just how engaging are they?
What are your thoughts on this question?
I'm looking at it a little bit more from a practicality standpoint. So if you take a look at a large governance structure or a large board, and you've got 50 board members, is thinking about how many truly actually engage. We've conducted surveys. I mean, Bob Harris talks about this, but I conducted the same survey here in Illinois that an average board size is 15 members. And so if you look at that, how do you get to that? How do you change your governance model? And I would suggest that the board as a whole, if you think about who actually engages, how many people is that? So if you have a board of 45 or 50, but you get those 15 people, that you use a method of attrition in order to downsize your board. Well, first you have to amend your bylaws to allow for that and change it to be reflective of that. And of course, your board's going to have to approve of it. But you may have enough of those board members who don't exhibit a lot of engagement to have a sense of relief. And so if you move from 50 to 15 and you use the process of attrition, so these board members, as they roll off, you just don't fill spots until you get down to the appropriate number. And at the same time, those board members who feel like they are want to stay engaged, is give them a different role and take a look at what your committee structure is and think about those people, especially when you have board members who are doers and not governors, you know, who are incapable of looking at that 50,000 foot level, who want to be in the weeds, restructure your committees, put those former board members into committees and let them do some of that work of the chamber or that association so that they feel that they still have ownership in the organization.
And to those on the call today, if you have any questions and follow-up, please feel free to drop that in the chat. Right, we're going to go on to the next question and start with Lisa. And Lisa, how do you differentiate a well-governed organization from a poorly governed one?
Well, I think the previous question may actually have a lot to respond to that. So the easy answer is if you have a board who is in the weeds all the time, if you have a board who wants to know everything that the staff is doing, if you have a board who shows up at your office and wonders why nobody's there at 12 o'clock or shows up at 8:30 and wonders why nobody's there, that is a poorly governed organization. It was, Ed mentioned it earlier, and it was clarified in the staff that the role of the board is to govern the organization and the role of the staff is to manage. The staff does the actual work of the organization and the board governs it. The board sets the goals for the organization and then the staff executes those goals. So if you have a board who is micromanaging events, telling you what color the tablecloth should be, if you have a board who wants to account for every minute of your day, the worst thing I hear is when an executive director or a president tells me that they do a report to their board every month of every activity or everything that they've done of every day of their week of the previous month, and it just makes my heart sink. Those are not well managed organizations.
And I did get a side message here. It sounds like there is still some audio going on. So as for the presenters here, just as a reminder, if we're not speaking, let's go ahead and mute. I think that may help. I just got some side message feedback that there is still some audio. So thank you all for staying with us as we're working through that. And Ed, what are your thoughts on this question of how do you differentiate a well-governed organization from a poorly governed one?
A well-governed organization, their board will focus on the very high level, the strategic focus of the organization. I once worked with an association who they had a board member that demanded to see the food that they served at the conference before they could finalize it. They would get so focused on mundane details at the board level that nothing got done. And to really echo Lisa's point, if your board is focused on the color of the tablecloths, the food you're going to serve, things like that, they're not focusing on the strategy and the governance of the organization. So a good governed organization has a board that stays at 35,000 feet, only gets down below that when they have to. They focus on the strategy and they guide the organization to fulfill its mission and vision, and their staff executes that plan. Poorly governed ones, the board is in the trenches with the staff doing the work, telling them how to do the day-to-day, and they're ignoring the strategy.
All right, I believe CC had more issues. We'll jump off to the next question. And Ed, I'll start with you. When is it appropriate for an employee to bring up an issue regarding governance?
So I'm going to take this question to put a little context behind it. The way I'm going to answer it is that this employee has observed something that equates to bad governance, to throw in a little context. So if you have an employee that has observed something that is not a governance best practice or something that doesn't really pass the smell test, as I like to say, when it comes to governance, first and foremost, you have to, talk to your executive director, your CEO, whoever is running your organization. And this is truly for those instances of, again, in the context I said, there's overreach, there's micromanagement from the board level, really those things that truly equate to bad governance. Disagreements happen all the time. Sometimes there's differing opinions on things. That's not bad governance, but it's really those things that are, excuse me, there's overreach, there's micromanagement, there's, flat out disagreement with, a staff decision. Those are the instances of bad governance, and that's when it's okay to raise your hand.
All right, same question to you, Lisa. Oop, Lisa, you're on mute for us.
I apologize, and I think I fixed my audio issues here. I think Ed pretty much covered it. The only time is if there's something going on with the executive director that they're misappropriating something, then an employee would go up to the board chair to discuss something. But typically, the board employs the executive director and who employs the staff. And typically there really isn't much reason to go up unless something's drastically wrong.
All right, I believe CC is now back with us. CC is traveling through this world in different ways, different devices.
Another dimension.
As a reminder, if any of these answers are sparking more questions for you, feel free to add them to the chat, and then we'll put them towards the end after our other attendee and preset questions. So back to CC.
And Lisa, we're going to kick off with you for this next question. And what are your thoughts on what are some resources for sample basic governance documents and samples of best practices?
Bob Harris. It's an easy answer. I will type his chcae.com. It's .com, right? Not .org in the chat. He has lots of great samples on his website. In addition, your state association, whether you're an association or a chamber, you typically have a state association. I am an association of chambers. So if they need any kinds of samples of basic governance documents, I have the gamut. I have all of them. I also have Bob's. And then there's the national organizations too. So ASAE and ACCE both have it. They have sample libraries, as does WACE. So there's a lot of options for samples. The nice thing is, thank you, Nathan, that if there's a person who you can reach out to get something a little bit more specific, and samples, especially if you have a unique situation.
Thank you. I'm sure Bob will appreciate the shout out. Everyone go spam him with questions. He'll wonder where it's all coming from. And Ed, what are your thoughts on this question? What are resources for basic governance documents and samples of best practices?
I'll probably just say ditto with everything that Lisa said, but Bob Harris especially is a wealth of knowledge, as is ASAE and all the state association societies. But start with Bob Harris, and no, we're not paid to say that.
And Lisa, if you don't mind sharing a little bit of what you just added here in the chat.
So Blue Avocado is a website that has a lot of samples. They're geared toward charities. They're not geared toward associations and chambers, but they have, in fact, they just had an email or a document yesterday that I sent to one of our members talking about questions for boards or forms for boards to use to ensure that they're doing the work that they truly need to be doing. So I'm sure you can just Google Blue Avocado, or Nathan could find the link for us and put it in the chat. And there's actually another really good site for that too, that if I think of it, I'll throw it in the chat.
Excellent, thank you. And this next question, we're going to go ahead and start with you, Ed, is a kind of a three-part question. So what is some practical advice for engaging with your board enough that, and we'll go through in kind of three parts, so that the organization benefits from their involvement, so that the organization is not stifled or slowed, and that they feel proud of their contributions and not burdened and burnt out. So I know that's a three-part question. Again, thank you to our attendees that submitted these before. What are your thoughts, Ed, on practical advice for engaging with your board in these different ways?
So I'll start with the first bullet regarding how the organization benefits. And when you have, or you're conducting your board orientation, or if you're stepping into the executive director, CEO's position for the first time, or there's a transition, is explaining to your board members that the decisions that they make really do drive the strategy of the organization, and that you want them to bring their ideas. Now, not every idea is a good one, but that's for the board to determine. So to encourage the involvement, encourage them to bring their thoughts forward. To the second bullet, it's kind of to piggyback off of that, is you want to encourage everyone to participate. Now, there's 50, 60 people on this call. We all have different personalities. We're all going to act differently on Zoom, locked in a room together, out at the bar, on a plane. We're all just going to approach things differently. And it's the same way in the boardroom. You may have somebody who's a board member who, when they come to the board meeting, they don't necessarily, they take good notes, they don't contribute a lot, but when it comes to between the board meetings, they answer emails, they give suggestions, things like that. So in those instances, you want to encourage everybody to contribute in the way that is positive for the organization and in a way that they feel comfortable in doing so. And then to the third bullet about feeling proud about their contributions is recognize your board when it's appropriate. If they've done something, make them, give them the pat on the back. There's a term that we kind of use sometimes at ASAE called plaque 'em and whack 'em. Basically, give them their plaque at the end of their term, thank them, let the next person come in. But to digress, not to digress on that, is you want to encourage everybody to contribute. And, sometimes, people have lives, people have businesses. If you're a chamber, these are running their businesses. They may not be able to make every meeting. They may not necessarily be able to respond to every email. And that's okay in the context of, as long as they're not violating any policy and they're not taking up space. But thank them for their contributions. Thank them for what they're doing. Make them feel a part of the board.
Thank you. And Lisa, what are your questions, or what are your thoughts on his 3-part question?
And just to add on to all of the good things that Ed said, that if you use the strategic plan, if you have a good, strong strategic plan, you use the goals from that plan to guide board discussions during board meetings, how you're achieving those plans, does anything need to be tweaked about the goals of the plan. The people at the board table are going to feel that their opinions are valued, that they're not picking out colors of tablecloths. It also allows the board to continue to feel future focused, so that they're not dealing with the day-to-day work of the staff. I would also ensure that the goals of the plan are allowing the board members to truly operate at that oversight level, at that governance 50,000-foot level, and to ensure that there's support for getting the work done, and that the board isn't doing the work by having committees that boards don't have to sit on, or maybe there's one board member who likes to be in the middle of everything, put them on a committee so they're getting valued feedback. They're the board member who gets to run the tablecloth design committee or whatever it might be, which is okay, a little too much, but as Ed said, make sure that they get recognition at your major events, and by thanking them, by giving them the introductory roles, and ensuring that they're visible. Something is, ensuring that they have ribbons that they could put on their name tags that say board member, things like that.
Thank you. Those are some great answers to this 3-part question. We have another multi-part question from a pre-submitted attendee, and this one builds on each other. So first, Lisa, we'll go ahead and start with you. How should the board be chosen? And then how should an executive committee be chosen from the full board? And what role should elective officials have on the board or executive board? And how do we define the roles of the board members and executive members versus the president or staff in general? So again, this question builds on each other. If you don't mind sharing your thoughts on each part of this question.
No problem at all. I believe, this is the Lisa world, the best way for a board to be chosen is to use a nominating slate. So the board has a nominating committee, typically including the officers or some of the officers and perhaps a board member or two at large, to put together a slate of nominees to fill the existing seats. Having a community-wide popularity contest often doesn't solve the needs of the board. When they're looking at individuals to serve on the board, the term board matrix comes to mind, where you think about in a chamber, oftentimes I think about industry slots. I encourage chambers to really move away from that and think about what kind of different sets of skills do you need to move your organization forward, to meet the goals of your strategic plan, but really to be future forward thinkers. And those are the people who the nominating committee should nominate to be on the slate, to be presented to the membership. And as far as executive committee, the way that I like to see that happen is that the officers of the board serve on the executive committee with 1 or 2 board members at large, complementing that. Sometimes, and I happened with a organization recently, the executive committee is like 2/3 of the board, which totally defeats the nimbleness of an executive committee. Well, and then as the role of elected officials, Bob Harris and I wrote an article about that a few years ago. I should have pulled that up for this because I knew this question was coming. But essentially, the easy answer is they should not have voting roles on your board. There are some, especially when we're talking about, chambers, they are in positions where they have to have their locally elected officials, their governor, their mayor, or not the governor, their mayor, their city, the village president on their board. In a perfect world, they show up in the beginning of the meeting, they give an update on what's happening with the village or with the city, and they leave. They don't have, but if they have to sit on your board, they have ex officio roles, so they're not voting members. I always speak to boards when I do board trainings and strategic plannings about the fact that in Illinois, we have very strict FOIA, Freedom of Information Act rules. And if you have a city official on your board and the executive director sends out board minutes or confidential information to all of those people, that their emails are FOIAble. And when that information isn't supposed to be public, it could too easily become public. And then the last one, defining the roles of board members, executive members. So for my organization, we have a document that clearly defines the roles of our board and what the different roles entail between an officer of the board and a board member at large. And if you have, and then the staff, the president of the organization and their staff, every year our board has to sign a document that lists their understanding of their roles, of their own roles. And in my case, I happen to be the only employee, so it makes it a little bit easier. But I would have board members every year during a board orientation or a board review or welcome to the board, whatever you call it, sign a document that is preferably gone over publicly about these are what the roles are, and this is what we expect you to adhere to during your service on the board.
Thank you. And Ed, what are your thoughts on these questions of how should a board be chosen, executive committee from the board, elected officials, and then defining the roles of the board members versus the staff and president?
I like what Lisa said about a nominating committee. I've seen nominating committees work very, very well with a lot of organizations. You let the nominating committee go through the slate of candidates, and then they find the ones that meet the criteria that you have to be a board member. And it ensures that it's not a popularity contest, or it's not, the same person doing everything, same board member for 20 years is running again. So that's a great way to, select your board candidates. The other thing is, regardless if you're a chamber, association, not-for-profit, charity, have what is your criteria to be a board member? Have a document somewhere that says that, okay, you need to meet A, B, C, and D to be eligible to run for the board. And it sounds so self-explanatory, but I've been involved in situations in the past where they had no criteria, and it was a popularity contest, even when they had a nominating committee, and you had a board member who had been on the board for 25 years, and they just could not find a way to get rid of them because they had no criteria. When it comes to your executive committee, I think in a perfect scenario, the executive committee is just the officers of your board. So your president, your treasurer, your secretary, vice presidents, if you have them, because they're the ones that, if a situation comes up and you can't convene the full board, those are the individuals that can meet and they can make an executive decision on the strategy. So at the very least, the officers of the board, I like the idea that Lisa brought up about maybe one or two other board members to kind of bring in a different perspective, but at the very least, the officers. The elected officials, again, I'm also in Illinois. I'm very familiar, unfortunately, with the FOIA laws. So that's a double-edged sword, having elected officials on your board. And I get it with chambers, sometimes you're required to do so. But I really think the ex officio role for elected officials is very, very important. Again, your bylaws may allow this, your state law may allow this, but there's kind of a bad optics when it comes to your mayor sitting on the chamber board and that could have, the ability to vote. It may not necessarily be against your bylaws, it may not necessarily be against your state law, but it's just one of those things that doesn't necessarily always look right. So that's why the ex officio roles, I think, are very, very important. And then defining the roles of the board members, and the staff. Like Lisa said, at the orientation, it's very, very important that there's kind of like a document or a presentation, however you want to make it work, that says, this is what the president does, this is what the executive director does, this is the responsibility of the treasurer. As a board member, this is your role and responsibility. Now, everybody sign off on it, or we all agree, so that you have kind of an outline of what everybody is expected to do and the responsibilities of those particular roles.
Excellent. And there was a question here in the chat, Ed, of what do you feel that the criteria should be? And this was when you were speaking of developing criteria in order to select. So, I believe it was the executive committee members.
To kind of dig a little deeper is, what criteria do you want someone to be eligible for a board member? Are you looking for somebody who has never served before? Do you have term limits? For chambers, do they have to be a business owner, or do they have to work at the business in the community? If you're an association, how do you have a requirement that they've been a member for X number of years before they're eligible? Things like that. Those are the certain criteria you could think of to kind of help you develop. All right, here's your slate of candidates, so long as they meet whatever you decide, whether it's business ownership or business working, membership, tenure, what have you.
Thank you. And again, if you do have questions, please feel free to drop that in the chat. We'll go on to the next question, starting with you, Ed. What are some insights for carefully managing a board member from a very large member company asserting influence or pressure regarding specific staff personnel? So going into some of the topics we've talked about of staff and board relations.
So in one of these situation like this, again, it kind of goes back to what we had said and what Bob Harris has said, is that boards govern, staff manage. Now, I understand that if you're a very large member company, that this person who's on the board may think that they have more influence because they are from a large company, or they have a lot of revenue, or they're very prominently known in the community. But as a board member, there really is no difference from one member to another aside from where they came from. So as a board member, on paper, their influence is no different. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. But I think for managing this, if there's a situation where you have a board member that's getting kind of too involved with, you know, the day-to-day, or they're starting to bring their company into the mix when they really shouldn't be, I think that's a time when you can pull, whether your executive director, chamber director, board chair, president, whoever is going to be best suited to handle that, kind of have a conversation with that member and say, hey, I understand that you're from, you know, ABC oil conglomerate, but, you know, we're here focusing on the needs of the chamber. We're not here to focus on the needs of your company. There might be mutually beneficial things, but ultimately this is about the chamber, or this is about the association, not about your company. So when you come into this board meeting, we expect you to follow your fiduciary duties, obedience, care, loyalty, which means you have to put your company's interests to the side and focus on the interests and obligations of your association.
Thank you. And Lisa, what are your thoughts on this question of how do you manage somebody asserting influence or pressure from the board on staff?
Well, I'm just going to add to what Ed said, but as the chief staff officer, the president or executive director, to start by carefully explaining to that person that this is your employee, not their employee, explaining that the board employs the CEO and the CEO employs the staff. And if they don't like the staff or they have concerns about the staff, their job is to bring that to you. Their job is not to bring it to the employee themselves. And if really they're not listening to you, is to bring in the board chair and have the board chair sit down and explain it to them.
We're getting some claps here from the audience. Definitely, thank you, and thank you for those answers. And we do have two final questions from attendees, and then we do have, for those joining the call, we do have other questions that we've prepared, but really we would love to hear, you know, and answer the questions. The most important is the questions are attendees submitted, so feel free if you have any that are coming up. We have two more pre-submitted questions, and we do have others, but if you have something that's coming to mind, just as a reminder, please feel free to drop that in the chat. And Lisa, we're going to start with you on this next question. And as we know, times are changing very rapidly, very quickly in the recent years. Are there any changes to best practices from the past couple years of how the industry is adapting very quickly? What best practices have emerged that are somewhat recent?
The few things that I can think about are when you're looking at strategic plans, they are shorter in term. So instead of 5-year, 3-year, that more strategic plans are only 2 years, sometimes a year, that they also have fewer goals so that organizations can be more nimble. Having said that, I had a strategic plan review this morning with a board. I did their planning a month ago and came up with 5 goals. And I said, I'm breaking my own best practice rule, but I think they were an outlier in their case and they liked it. So that's an outlier. Another thing that has changed is committees. I have heard, well, we've always had committees and we've always had committees do it this way, and committees have been great and people love being on committees, but any longer people don't like serving on standing committees where they have to commit a certain amount of time over a certain length of time. People they'll be happier, or you're more likely to get more effective task forces or shorter term. We just need 5 people to do this one thing for 20 minutes, this one time this month, and we'll have a solution. So those are the 2 that just jumped to the top of my mind.
Thank you. And Ed, what are your thoughts? Any changes to the best practices from the past few?
Over the past couple of years, to kind of piggyback off Lisa's point, I'm starting to see or hear a lot of discussions about redefining a standing committee and focusing more on micro volunteer opportunities or task force instead of having standing committees. For twofold, as Lisa said, it's a lot for standing committee. It's a long time commitment, depending on what your committee structure, your bylaws state. And chambers that I've worked with and associations that I've worked with, they want to start to get a new pool of volunteers. So they've realized that if we go to task force, or we go to, an ad hoc committee, or these micro volunteer opportunities, that we can get new people and try to see, hey, is this somebody who, they spend an hour with us at a ribbon cutting ceremony one Saturday, and they've done 3 of them now, the last 3, maybe we could bring them in for something else. So it's a great way to kind of meet new people, meet your volunteers, and get a new influx of volunteers that might commit a little bit longer. The other thing, and I'm sure a lot of people are sick of hearing about it, but is the influx of AI into, the day-to-day and the board. And there's been a lot of changes to, how AI has been, approached. A couple years ago, when AI first became a thing, everybody was like, oh no, we don't want to touch it, we don't want to use it. What I've started to see is a lot of, we're going to embrace AI because it can help us, but here are the guardrails that we're going to put in place so that we're not, opening ourselves up to some copyright issue or to anything like that. So I've really started to see a lot of more embracing of AI, but in a responsible way with the appropriate safeguards and guardrails being put in place.
Excellent. Excellent. We have one final attendee pre-submitted question, and then we do have some questions coming in from the chat that we'll go to next. So the final pre-submitted question, and Ed, we'll go ahead and start with you on this one. Looking for ways to get the board excited to engage. What would you say, the single most effective way to do that? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I'll give you the funny answer first. That would be food, because all board members like to eat. But all kidding aside, maybe not, is that you want to show, if you're staff and you're putting together a board meeting, is you want to show them that you welcome their opinion. You're going to welcome them to be engaged. Give them opportunities to give back in other ways. We talked about it earlier. When you have your meetings or you have your events, a little ribbon that says board member can do so much to give somebody a warm and fuzzy feeling inside and make them want to contribute more and to be, more engaged. So recognizing your board is important. I know everybody on this call is going to come from different backgrounds and different, organizations. Some of the larger organizations that I've worked with, or those that have a little bit of a deeper pocket, have done board retreats as a part of their board orientation, where it's a mix of business and fun to kind of help them to get to work together and to make them feel like, they're not only are we giving back to this organization, the organization is giving back to us as well for volunteering. So it really is just about giving them the thanks and the, praise, quote unquote, to make them have that warm and fuzzy feeling.
Thank you. And Lisa, what are your thoughts on this? What's the single most effective way to engage a board in your opinion?
I may add beer or wine to that food. It's a funny way, but I have to share a very quick story. I once served on a very large association, and our quarterly meetings were started on a Friday evening with a reception, dinner. Then we had governance training for a couple of hours. We would get up Saturday morning and we'd have more governance training, and then we'd have like reports from all the staff, and then some more governance training, and then we would actually hold our board meeting, which sounds horrible to some people, but for me, it was the most motivating way to be engaged. And this started right around the same time that I started with IACCE, so it was a nice match. But the to Ed's point, ensuring that they feel engaged in the work that you're doing at a high level So if you select your board members, or if the nominating committee has a appropriate slate of board members who are excited about the governance aspect, what are the big hairy ass goals of your organization, and that's what they're excited about, and spend time at every single board meeting or every time that you're together talking about that over food, that's a way to keep people excited. Give them public recognition about that as well, if you can do that. But just, and if you can build in time for your board just to spend social time together, talking about what a great organization that they get to govern, goes a long way.
Excellent. Thank you. And we have a couple questions here from the chat. So we're going to conclude with the slideshow presentation of this and go into a little more free form. So we have a question here. First, thank you to both of you. And they said, I think it was alluded already throughout the webinar, but for a board that's used to being hands-on, what's one piece of advice you'd offer as their first full-time CEO to help them successfully shift their focus from operations to governance? And Lisa, if we can go ahead and start with you on this one. Thank you.
Thank you. I just worked with a board about this, and the first thing that I would say to that CEO is, does the board want to work toward a governance model? Because they may not, and if they are used to being a working board because they haven't had a full-time CEO, that might be a little bit slower process. But I would have conversations with them and encourage them to grow into a governance board, maybe as a step up model, and to use committees instead of a working board. And this is exactly what we're working on with this one organization, where most of the board does not want to be a hands-on working board. They want to be a true governance board. But there are board members who want that hands-on, and that's what they're used to, and that's what they, in their minds, that's what they signed up to do. So it's starting by saying, okay, let's take the natural talents of those working board members, put them into a committee structure, have them chair committees, and then they get that charge, that enjoyment out of their service. They stay on the board, but they're chairing a working committee. And then you start having them do reports to the board and a consent agenda, so you don't have to listen to them go on and on how great their committee is for 20 minutes. I would say, did I just say that out loud when I'm in a safe space here? And then they get that feeling, but they're at the board level, and then you move your board meetings to a higher level agenda structured on the goals of your strategic plan instead of old business, new business.
And Ed, I'm seeing your head nod. What are your thoughts on this question, if you don't mind sharing?
So the committee, if you have board members that are really kind of roll up your sleeves, we're a working board, putting them on a committee is going to be the best way to find that happy medium where they're still doing work, that roll up your sleeves work, but they're not getting involved with, you know, the day-to-day operations that now you have an executive staff to handle. The other thing just to keep in mind is that this shift is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time. There's going to be some speed bumps and roadblocks in the way. But to Lisa's point is that if you have a board that has been a working board for so long that now they're ready to kind of take that next step, that's half the battle. Is that when they're ready to move to become a governing board, a strategic board, and start focusing on the strategy and focus of the organization, then it's just about, okay, you know, finding those working board members that should also be on a committee. It's finding the right balance of, okay, as the executive staff, we're going to handle this. I know you've done this for the last 5 years. So I'm going to put this in an executive director report that you'll get once every quarter. So it's still, you still feel like they're informed about what's going on, but they're not dealing with that day-to-day stuff that they might have done. But it's going to take time.
Excellent. And we have a final attendee question, and Ed, we'll go ahead and start with you on this one. What is the best way to manage ex officio's office that have to manage ex officios that have a permanent seat on the board with voting rights? We often find that conflicts of interest arise and create an environment of intimidation or monopolization of conversations and decisions. In an effort to remove voting was unsuccessful. What are your thoughts on that? Ed, we'll start.
Well, the first and foremost, I'm going to start with the conflict of interest thing, is that, as board members, whether they're, if the person is ex officio with voting rights, they're still technically a board member, and they have a duty to avoid conflicts of interest. And if there is a continuous issue with conflicts of interest, other board members do have the ability to speak up and say, hey, I think we're getting into an area where we're one or more of us might be conflicted, or we might make a decision that's not going to put the organization's best interests first. So that's the one thing to keep in mind, is that elected official or not, if they're voting on the board, they're a board member, they have a duty to avoid conflicts of interest. The other thing that I would consider approaching, and obviously in a delicate manner as needed, is that if elected officials are sitting on your board, it's the board for the chamber. It's the board for, the Convention and Tourism Bureau, whatever it might be. It's not their village board. It's not City Hall. It's not Congress. Even though they're an elected official, they're there in a very different capacity than what they were elected to do. So it kind of comes back to, the fiduciary duties. They've got to put the organization first. They can't, the mayor of your town, who might be a voting member on the chamber board, can't go to the chamber meeting thinking it's the weekly village board meeting, because it's just not going to work. And that's not what the chamber board is there to do.
Thank you. And Lisa, your quick thoughts on that question of what's the best way to manage ex officios that have a permanent seat on the board with voting rights?
In addition to what Ed said, have them sign a conflict of interest form that can be clearly stating that, and change your bylaws and make them not allowed to be voting members. Right. That would be the easiest way. They may not get it, but they will after a few votes where their vote doesn't count.
Yeah. And I know we are close here on time, so we'll do a rapid fire on this last question, starting with Lisa. Any thoughts on a question regarding approving the board slate? Are there reasons to have a vote of the full membership of that slate versus a vote of existing board members? Struggling when most members could care less. What are your general thoughts on that question?
You just put them all onto one slate and just do it that way. I mean, at least that's how we do it. It's just, we've actually just moved to a PowerPoint. I asterisk who the new board members are, and then, set it up for our board chair. So you've got new members, existing members, and just vote them all in at one time and move on to the next thing.
Excellent. Ed, rapid fire, what are your thoughts on that? How would you handle that?
I would agree with Lisa. Put them all on one slate, get them in, move on.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for staying with us and joining us today. This was a very informative panel, and I really appreciate Lisa and Ed, your guys' knowledge and expertise. I know I've been taking notes, and appreciate all the engagement and the questions that we had throughout, both before the webinar and in the chat here. And just as a reminder for those that did join us late, Institute is a CAE and a CCE approved provider, so it does qualify for 1 point of CAE credit and 1 point of CCE, and you can request a webinar certificate if you joined us live today by emailing us, and we will have a recording available of this if you'd like to reference this later. So thank you, Lisa and Ed, and thank you everyone that joined us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.